Hello everyone, in this video we're going to learn about events in JavaScript. And so what I have here is an almost empty code pen. I have a heading and a tiny bit of CSS, and we're going to learn about events. So what are events? Events are things that react to events that happen in the browser usually, because we're talking about front-end web development with JavaScript. There are a lot of events that we can do in the browser, which are pretty amazing, like click events, mouse overs, form submission, and then other things like video playing, errors occurring, the page is finished loading, resizing, key presses. There's all sorts of events we can do. But let's look at the most common examples, for example, on click handlers. So what I can do is have a button, and I can say, click me to count. And then in my JavaScript, I can have, well, first let's do a div, and this is going to have an ID of count. All right, so in my JavaScript, I am going to first target that button. So I want to say const button equals document dot query selector, and once again we use how we would target these like the same as CSS selectors. So this is just a button. I only have one button on the page and it's fine. Then I want to add a listener, but first I'm going to write the function that I want to happen. So I want to say function count. And right now we're just going to, actually I won't do console log, I'm just going to do an alert so that we can see it right away. Alert, clicked, and now we add the actual event listener. So I can say button dot on click equals, and we can say count. So we only give it the function name as count because we're setting the handler to be count. We don't want to invoke it. That would be invoking it or running it right away. But we don't want to invoke it. We want to wait for that to happen until the click happens. So this is saying when someone clicks, I want you to run this function. So if I click, it says clicked, which is what we want to happen. And now we can actually do code that, let me put the number 0 in there. And in our code, we can say let current count equal 0. So that's what happens when the page is loaded. But now we want to increment that count and then update the number here. So I can say, first I need to target this div so I know where to put it. So const, I can just say div equals document dot query selector. I mean, it should be count div or something like that. Pound is for an ID, count. I'll say count div. All right, so we have that, and every time count happens, we want current count to increase by 1. So we can do current count plus plus. Remember, that just means current count equals current count plus 1. And then I want to dump that into the div. So I could say count div dot inner text equals current count. So let's Save that. And then I can click. Look at that. That's pretty cool. Oh, I don't like that it changed my orientation when I saved. There's another way we can write event handlers. This was the original or a little bit older school way to write them, or actually they were in HTML, but don't do that because it gets confusing if you do it in HTML and it's just not a great idea anymore. So this was, I guess, revision 2 of how handlers were written, or events were written. But we have a new one that has a little bit more power. And this is a perfectly great way to add event handlers for the ones that are available. But we can also write them as event listeners with add event listener. So we can say button.add event listener. And this takes at least 2 parameters. The first one is what type of event you're listening for. And in this case, we're listening for a click. And then we have our event handler, which is count. So it's very similar to this, except it's a little bit wordier, but it can do a bit more for you. Like you can remove event listener and you could add more than one event listener if you do it this way. So if we do button.add event listener, click count, it should function the same way. So if I click count, it works. We didn't talk about this in functions, but we can actually use anonymous functions, and anonymous functions just don't have a name. They literally look like this. Function, oops. And then you do your function things, do things. That's an anonymous function. And another way to write that is as an arrow function. So this is called an arrow function, and it's an ES6 or modern JavaScript feature. Do things. For example, we can, when you have like something simple, maybe you don't want to create a whole function because it's pretty simple. What you can do instead, so say I didn't have that, is I could just write the function in here. And so you could say function, like you've learned, function like this, and then write your code, and that code is these 2 lines. So that's one way to do it, and let's make sure that still works. Yep, it still works. And then the other way is to do this as an arrow function. And so you just remove the word function, and then after the parentheses, you add an equal sign and an arrow. And so that is an arrow function, and that essentially does the same thing. And you're going to see this more often because it's shorter, and so developers are using it a bit more. So it's something to be aware of even if you choose not to use it yet. The other way, we can actually use arrow functions to declare functions in our code also. So if I comment that out again and then uncomment this. So this was our original way we did this, right? 1, 2, 3. What we can do is we can say const count. So we can set a constant equal to an arrow function. And so you'll see this a lot too. And this is just a function. But if you see this notation, it means that this is a function. So you don't have to get worried that it's something totally new. It just looks a little bit different, and some people prefer this over the function notation. All right, let's talk about targets. So let's make a new little section in here, and actually we'll just do a new button. So button, click me to change my color. All right. We want these buttons to be a bit bigger. So let's go into our CSS and say button. We want our padding to be, let's do 8 px on the top and bottom and 12 px left and right. Let's see, yeah, that looks a little bit bigger. And We want the font size to be bigger too. I don't like how by default they're so small. Font size is 1M, so it should be 16px. And we should maybe put some space between these. So I could put them in an article or something and then format the articles so that they're separated. Or I could put this div in a paragraph instead. So if I save that, there's a little bit more space now. Click me to count. Or I could put that span after the thing. These are just different things to think of. But what we want to happen when we click this is that it changes the color of the button. So let me hide that again. And we should probably, oh, you know what? It's oh, look, it only, the query selector, it only chooses the first one. So if I reordered these buttons, it would actually change my, the way my program works. Like if I click that, it would change that and this wouldn't. So in general, we probably want to be a bit more specific than just button. So I can say ID equals count button. So instead we can put count button. All right. And now it should be that. Okay, that still works. I didn't want to break it. And then this one is ID color button. All right. So now we can start coding. We want to grab this button and then we're going to put an event on that button. That's an on-click event. Oh, we could do a mouse over or something to make it different. Let's do that. Let's make this a div. Oops. Buttons should be clicked, but once we change that, we can change it to something like a div. And we want this pound color button to be, we'll say a padding of 24px. And maybe let's give it a border. Border is going to be 1px solid, say CCC. Let's see what color, how is that? All right, it's super wide. I didn't really want it to be the full width, but that's all right. And instead we're gonna mouse over me to change my color. So when we mouse over, we want the color to change because I wanna play with some different event types. So we can say const. This isn't a button anymore. We'll just call it color. Const color div equals document dot query selector and it's pound color. All right. So we have that. And we want our mouse over function. So I'm going to call this, I'll use actually there's an arrow function up there. So I could do it again, just say const. And here I need to give it a parameter called E or event. I'm going to keep it as E because most of the time you're going to see that as E. I forgot to do my arrow or my equal sign. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to console.log e.target so we can look at what this target is. And then I'm going to do document, color div.add event listener and maybe mouse over. I'm actually not sure what it's called. Well, it needs to be in quotes. We'll see if this works. Mouse over, and the function that we want to happen when a mouse over happens is called change color. All right, let's see what happens. We're going to save that. I'm going to inspect so I can see my console. Let me refresh this page because I think there's a lot of old stuff in there. All right, that still works. Oh, console.lot is not a function. That is a true statement. So we need to say log and not lot. Save. And oh, look at that. Mouse over me to change my color. So we see the target is this whole div. So that's pretty cool. So now I'm going to create another function that this function is going to use because I don't want to pollute my functions with too many things. And I'm going to change this back to function because I think you're more used to seeing regular functions rather than arrow functions. And I don't want it to be confusing. So we want function random color, and we're going to use the RGBA to get this. And so what we want to do is return RGB. We're basically going to return an RGB color function that would be used in CSS. Like I could say something like, maybe I want my H1 to have a color of, in case you haven't seen RGB colors before, and they are on a RGB red, green, blue. So if I do 25500, that would be completely red. So they're kind of fun to play with if you know color combinations well. I also like HSLA, which is fun. Actually, that might be a little less complicated. Why don't we do HSL? So HSL is hue, saturation, lightness, and H saturation I think is percent. Because it doesn't like this. There's a reason. Let's inspect it. It doesn't like this because, oops, invalid property value. Let's look at CSS HSL. Here we go. So examples, the 2-second ones. So hue is a number, and then saturation and lightness are percents. I think it still doesn't like this. If I change this, well, let's. Oh. Okay. So I made my saturation 0. So when you're at 0 saturation, you're at black. Let's do 80. So we don't want to blind people with something like super bright. And 80 saturation, lightness 0 also. Let's put this at 50. All right. Now we're working somewhere. Okay, so we're going to keep the saturation and lightness the same, but we want this number to change. And what HSL does, or hues are this wide circle of different hues. So they go through all different colors, and then you can modify saturation and lightness. So that's how HSL works, whereas RGB is a mixture of red, green, and blue. So what I can do is I'm going to change this to HSL, and I want to randomize what the first number is. So first, let me just, I'm going to dump that in there. That's for my first number. And then for my second and third ones, I'm going to keep those the same as what's in the code. 80%. So what I want to do is do a random number in here. So I'm, let's do, I think it goes up to 270. So we need a const. Let's call it random. Random hue would be more accurate. Random hue equals math.floor and inside of math.floor means round it down. We want math.random because we don't want some decimal thing. So we want math.random, which math.random generates a random number between 0 and 1, so it's actually decimals. And then we're going to multiply that times our max number plus 1, which I think is 271. Let's see if that works. And then we want that random hue to be dumped in here. And that gives us a random color that we can then apply to this div. So we can do that. We have our change color thing and we're showing our e.target when we mouse over, right? It's this. So now we need to change the CSS on this element, and we can do that with event.target.style.background color equals random color. So let's see what happens. Save that. Oh, that is pretty awesome.